They thought power belonged to men. They thought control could be imposed and accepted. But in 1929, in southeastern Nigeria, that belief was about to collapse. Before the British arrived, Igbo society was not ruled by kings. Power was shared. Decisions were made in assemblies. Voices mattered. And women were not silent. They had their own institutions, their own gatherings, their own authority in markets and communities. They could challenge decisions. They could hold leaders accountable. Balance existed, but colonial rule changed everything. By the early 20th century, the British had expanded across Nigeria, but ruling directly was difficult. So they introduced a system, indirect rule. Instead of governing themselves, they appointed local men to rule on their behalf. They called them warrant chiefs. On paper, it looked efficient. In reality, it was deeply flawed. Many of these men were not traditional leaders. They were chosen by colonial authorities and given power they had never held before. And with that power came abuse. Corruption spread. Authority became force. Communities were no longer being led, they were being controlled. And the voices of the people, especially women, were pushed aside. The balance that once existed was broken. Then, in November 1929, in a quiet town called Oloko, everything changed. The air was tense. Rumors had already begun to spread. A colonial agent had arrived. His mission seemed simple. Count the people, count the houses, count the wealth. To the British, it was administration. But to the women, it meant something else. Taxes. Men were already being taxed. Now there was fear that women would be next. And in that moment of uncertainty, one woman stood her ground. Her name was Nwanyeruwa. When the agent approached her home, he began to count her property, her goats, her household, her livelihood. She refused. Voices rose, tension filled the air, and then she said, "You count me?" It was more than a question. It was defiance. People nearby began to gather. They watched, they listened. What started as a single confrontation became something much bigger. The story spread, from one woman to another to entire communities. Through markets filled with traders, through village paths and distant compounds, through whispers and urgent calls, women began to mobilize, not in dozens, not in hundreds, but in thousands. They came from different towns, different villages, different backgrounds. But they were united by one thing: they would not be ignored. They didn't carry weapons, they carried something far more powerful: their voice. They turned to a traditional form of protest known as sitting on a man. It was not random, it was strategic. They would gather at the homes of warrant chiefs. They would surround them. They sang, they chanted, they mocked, they demanded answers, they clapped, they danced, and they refused to leave. Day after day, night after night. The noise was relentless, the pressure was constant. It was impossible to ignore. Warrant chiefs were overwhelmed. Some fled, some hid, some were forced to listen. And the movement kept growing. From Oloko, it spread to Aba, then to Owerri, then to Calabar. Entire regions began to rise. More than 10,000 women became part of the resistance. They marched through towns, they blocked roads, they shut down colonial courts, they surrounded administrative buildings. This was not a small protest anymore. This was a movement, and for the British, this was something they had never seen before. Not an army, not a rebellion led by chiefs or kings, but a decentralized, unstoppable force. At first, colonial authorities dismissed them. They saw women, not a threat, but the protests did not fade. They grew, louder, bigger, bolder. Control began to slip, fear began to rise, and then the response changed. Troops were deployed, armed forces were sent in to restore order. The atmosphere shifted. What had been protest was now confrontation. Crowds gathered, voices rose, tension filled the air, and then gunfire. Unarmed women were shot, panic spread, screams filled the air, bodies fell. Across the region, colonial troops opened fire. Dozens of women were killed. Many more were injured. The sound of resistance turned into the sound of loss. But even in the face of bullets, the movement did not disappear overnight. That alone sent a message. This was no ordinary protest. This was a people refusing to be controlled. And now, the world was watching. The pressure became too much to ignore. The colonial government was forced to respond. Investigations began, reports were written, questions were asked, and change followed. Plans to tax women were abandoned. Warrant chiefs began to lose their power. Some were removed, others were reduced to shadows of authority. The system itself was questioned. New structures began to take shape. and slowly the balance that had been broken began to return. What became known as the Aba Women's War of 1929 was one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings led by women in history. No army, no weapons, just unity, courage, and resistance. It exposed the weakness of colonial control and reminded the world power does not only come from force, sometimes it comes from voices that refuse to be silenced. They thought they could control the people. They thought they could end the resistance. But they were wrong, because from the forests to the streets to the hearts of the people, the fight never truly ended. It only changed its form. Follow and subscribe for more untold histories.